Hello. Today is Monday, September 16th, and welcome to episode 360 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Lester Munson, and I'm joined today by founder and executive director Jamil Jaffer, NSI's newest fellow, Jessica Jones, and my fellow senior fellow, Morgan Vina. Today, we are going to talk about President Biden's decision to take a trip to Africa before the election. He is going to the country of Angola in southern Africa. He is going there to talk about the Lobito Corridor project. You might ask, what is the Lobito Corridor project? That is a massive US and EU and local government effort to build a railroad to help extract critical minerals and other commodities from Central Africa, bring them to the Atlantic Ocean, which is where Lobito is. It's a town on the Angolan Atlantic coast, and then provide those materials for processing for the EV industry and other things. We're talking about copper, lithium, cobalt. This project is funded in the US by the Development Finance Corporation, or the DFC, which was created, interestingly, during the Trump administration as a foreign assistance initiative. So there's some bipartisan bones here to this project. President Biden, of course, is a lame duck president. He will not be serving in office past January 20th of next year. So let's talk about the significance of this trip, the significance of the issue, and where we think things are going. Morgan, I'm going to go to you first. This is rolling in hot Monday morning. Let's hear your take.
This is undoubtedly a very important project when it comes to U.S. strategic competition with China. Undoubtedly, this is what the DFC was really intended for, these kinds of projects. It's an incredibly important project between the United States and African nations. At the same time, a lot of needless CO2 emissions are being blown into the atmosphere by Biden going over to the continent. Biden is a lame duck president. He has zero influence here. I think it would have been far more impressive, well, at least far more effective, if he were to bring, several of Kamala Harris's top foreign policy national security aides, so that you could have a glimpse of what perhaps, a future Democratic administration might look like. But at the same time, though, there's very little Biden can actually do to move the needle here. The Angolans aren't really, I don't think, going to be impressed by this. This trip was originally supposed to happen following the bilateral meeting with the president last year. Biden, of course, didn't go because of October 7th and the Hamas attacks on Israel. By the way, Biden, I would argue, still should have gone. And if we had a president capable of doing more things than one on his calendar each day, then maybe we would have been able to see the needle moved earlier on. But this is where we are.
Jamil, Angola scores pretty high on the corruption index. It is not exactly a democracy. It's kind of a one-party state. The MPLA, the ruling party, has some terrific roots in Soviet communism, of all things. Is this the kind of country, the kind of government the Biden administration should be embracing to help secure our clean energy future?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, we've got to look out for American national security interests and economic security interests. And there's no doubt that cobalt, which is 70% of the world's cobalt, is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Getting it out to the coast is critical. And then processing is critical, not to mention copper, lithium, the other critical and strategic metals that you referred to, all of which are important to the EV transition, but also to defense applications, aerospace applications, and the like. And so, you've got to deal with who you've got to deal with. And so while the Angolan government might not be our favorite in nature, or its history with the Soviets might not be ideal, that being said, there have been a number of civil wars in that country, and that we participated in part during the Cold War. So look, at the end of the day, though, you've got to deal with who you've got in power. And the reality is that Angola is an opportunity for the United States to break China's stranglehold on the acquisition of minerals there in Africa. We've paid too little attention to Africa for far too long. It's a critical continent, not just for American economic and national security purposes, but for the global economy. But then you've got to think about what happens after you get the minerals out of Africa, assuming that you're even able to do this deal. And yes, the $250 million that DFC is going to spend here are an important spend of money. But at the end of the day, you got to be able to process those minerals as well. And when 90+% of the processing, particularly for minerals like cobalt, is controlled by China, all you're going to do is take the minerals out and then send them to China for processing. So we've got to modify our laws here in the United States, both to acquire some of those rare earth and strategic metals that are available here in the U.S., but also to process them here and in our abroad with our friendly countries. So that, and by the way, that's going to be part of what happens in Africa as well, processing there in Africa as well. So these are part of the things that the Chinese are not thinking about, and part of what we ought to be doing to help buttress ourselves there in Africa.
Jones, the Chinese are taking over a rail line called Tazara, which would go from Central Africa to the Indian Ocean coast of Tanzania, basically in the opposite direction, so that they can glom onto all of this valuable stuff. What do you think of this competition and Jamil's comments about processing?
First of all, I'd like to point out, I think it's funny, Les, your theory that everything that happens moving forward is tied to the election and that we should see every single story we see on this show about the election. I wonder how that works for this one, because I don't see how Biden going to Africa like bring, props up Harris in the presidential election. So I'm really interested on your take on that one. But, I think to Morgan's point, if I was an African nation leader, I'm not sure I'd be impressed. You've got Joe Biden coming out years too late, and you've got him kind of taking a playbook from the Chinese. He's doing a large infrastructure deal that the U.S. has tended not to do. African leaders want trade, not aid, but this may be not necessarily what they mean by that. And while we're investing a lot to build this railway, I haven't read as much about the value add, whether it's manufacturing or processing, that we intend to actually happen on continent. So if I was African leaders, it would seem like a pretty similar project. And I would say, okay, is this the start of something bigger? Like, what's next after this project? And we've talked on the show, we're not likely going to outcompete or outspend China when it comes to Belt and Road. That's not in our playbook. So what's the long-term play? Like, if this is step one. So I think that I need a devil's in the details. So I want to see, a little bit more about this project.
Jamil, did you have a reaction?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that we're taking a page from the Chinese playbook, right? We're not using extortative loan programs with massive interest rates on the back end. I mean, we are trying to provide a capacity. Yes, we are acting in our national interest. There's no doubt. And I do agree with Jessica that we ought to try and figure out how to make this deal more in the interest of the African countries. That'll benefit us there, both against China, but generally writ large. And so having some processing on continent will matter. But I don't think it's fair to just sort of tag us with we're just stealing from the Chinese playbook and just building more infrastructure. Leader,
would you see this so fundamentally differently than what China's offering? You might get more jobs for for folks on the ground, but I just don't think I'd be that impressed. Like, this is some wholesale change coming from the Americans.
All right, I'm going to answer Joan's question. I think this actually is related to the election. I think that he wants to get Biden. Jamil's dog agrees with me. I think the Harris campaign is very much in favor of President Biden getting out of the country, going and doing some kind of easy hit diplomatic events like this, like going to Angola, where everything will be scripted. It'll look good. Evangelicals will like it. The African, expatriate community in the U.S. will probably appreciate some of it. Folks with PhDs will appreciate it.
What's the big?
This is important election micro-targeting, my friends.
The massive PhD vote, the massive Angolan vote. I mean, come on, Les. Be serious.
There's Africanists in all 50 states. I've always said
two on this podcast.
Yeah, two on this podcast. Exactly. I think we found the voting electorate right here.
50% of this podcast, of course, one of us is opposed, one of us is in favor of the trip. Here's my one prediction, though.
Watch out. I'm not. I think the trip is. We just don't need it. It's needless.
Morgan's worried about the environment, Les.
Yeah,
she's worried about the
CO2.
Morgan, I'm counting that as a no. Here. I'm counting that as a no from you on the trip. I'm going to go yes, but I will say, watch out for local politics. There is a copper mine in Panama that is now completely shut down because of protests over the alleged effect on the environment. Watch for this thing to get totally screwed up. It's very complicated. Things are going to go haywire. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think we're going to learn a lot by this process. And I would say actually good for President Biden for going to Africa. He probably should have done it a year or two ago. All right. That's a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Wednesday, September 18th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. Fault Lines is on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.